All right, well, we will go ahead and get started. So today's class, we're going to be talking about the different contracts that we can use to buy and sell residential real estate. From that perspective, there's pretty much two contracts that we use, and then there are several addendums that go with each contract. The two different contracts that we can use are what's called the as-is contract, and the other one is called the CRSP, the Contract for Residential Sale and Purchase. So sometimes also hear that called the CRISP contract. So the as-is and the CRISP contract. For the most part, a lot of the language in the two contracts is very similar. So you're going to fill out a lot of the same information. You're going to do a lot of the same things with both contracts. You only need one per purchase. You don't have to fill out both. A lot of times it's the preference of the seller, which contract they want us to use. But the biggest difference between as-is contract and the CRISP contract is how inspection and maintenance is determined in the particular property. So with an as-is contract, essentially what that means is that the buyer is accepting the property in the condition as it is. There's no legal obligation for the seller to make any improvements or upgrades. Even if an inspection report comes back and says, everything's broken in the house, because you're using the as-is contract, there's no legal requirements for the seller to do anything. There's practical requirements, which we'll talk about, what happens with inspections and things like that. But from a contract and from a legal perspective, the as-is contract doesn't force the seller to do anything with inspection repairs. The CRISP contract is a little bit different, though. It does have certain requirements of a seller. So let's say the inspection report comes back and we're using the CRSP contract, and in the CRISP contract we say the seller has to fix up to $2,000 worth of repairs. Well, let's say we do our home inspection and issues come up, and let's say there are $1,500 worth of repairs that need to be done. Well, because the CRSP contract says that up to $2,000 the seller has to fix, the seller has to do it. So pros and cons with each. With the as-is contract, obviously the seller doesn't have to do any work, but it does give the buyer a lot of reasons to back out of the contract, or a lot of capabilities to back out of the contract. Whereas the CRSP contract, the seller is going to have to do some repairs, but it's much more difficult for a buyer to back out of the CRSP than it is the as-is. So those are the biggest differences between the two, an as-is and a CRSP. You can use, again, it depends on which one the seller is going to use. More often than not, we're seeing as-is contracts being used just because today it's much more of a seller's market. The contracts are geared, today for sellers. Sellers tend to have a little bit more say. As we get a little bit more towards an equal market and a buyer's market, we're probably going to see more of the CRSP contract come into play with that.
So more people like our situation where they
typically, so a lot of it also depends on the condition of the home. So if you're buying a home that needs a whole lot of repairs, you're probably not going to use the CRSP just because it's going to mandate the seller to fix a lot of the issues with the home. Whereas, if I'm a seller of a home that's in very bad condition, I don't want to fix that. I just want to get rid of it. I'm going to use the as-is contract versus the CRSP contract. Yep. So with that, we'll kind of dive into these contracts a little bit. What's nice with our technology, so we use Transaction Desk through the MLS. That's our software that manages all of our contract documents. It does our e-signatures as well as it fills out a lot of the contracts. What we can do is, before we even start with a contract, through the MLS, there's a button right on each listing that says Transaction Desk. And so if we click that, it'll automatically open up a profile for us to start a transaction. And what that does is it'll pull a lot of the data already. So for example, here we have in paragraph 1 property description. If we already have the property selected from the MLS or from the tax records, it's going to fill in all this information for us. So we don't have to go look up the county or the legal description. It's going to know that information for us. It's even going to pull the seller, specifically how it's listed in the property tax record. So you can certainly start with a blank contract if you want to, but it's a lot easier using the templates that are already in Transaction Desk, because again, it's going to pull that information for us. And I'm going to go over the as-is contract. You'll find that, again, that the language in the CRSP contract, the CRISP contract, is very similar. It's going to ask for the buyer and the seller, legal description, price, and all that. It's just laid out in a little bit different format. But for the most part, they're pretty much asking for the same things. So some things that we need to be aware of as real estate agents. And from this perspective, we're going to go as if we're representing the buyer, because a lot of times when in a contract, it's the buyer that's the one that's actually writing this contract. So from that perspective, the biggest things, to go, we'll start line by line, lines 1 and 2, it may seem obvious, but buyers and sellers, we need to know who they are. And specifically, what legal entity is going to be taking ownership of this property? So is it a single person? Is it a married couple? Are they two cousins? Is it an LLC? How you write this name on this contract line is going to dictate all the other documents moving forward. So the type of company is going to use, this mortgage company is going to use the contract. How we specifically spell out who the buyers are, even if you misspell the name, or if it's going to be a married couple versus an unmarried couple, all of that makes a big difference in how the buyers are. So make sure when you're talking to your buyers, say, how do you want to take ownership of this home? Is it you? Is it both of you? Is it a corporation? Make sure you get all their spellings correctly, because again, this is going to dictate the rest of the terms of the contract. Paragraph 1D has to do with personal property. So there are a lot of things that are included with the home when a buyer looks to buy a home. And it specifically lists the items that are included and things that you would expect, refrigerator, dishwasher, smoke detectors, garage door openers, things like that, ceiling fans. There are a few specific things that are not included here. One of the most notable ones are a washer and dryer. So if your buyer is looking to purchase this property and they also want to keep the existing washer and dryer, in line 20 here, we would have to type in washer and dryer. Otherwise, it's assumed that the seller is going to take the washer and dryer with them. And if your buyer thinks, well, I get to keep the washer and dryer, well, per the contract, it doesn't say that the buyer gets to keep the washer and dryer. So with any time that you have a disagreement or any time that you're uncertain with things, always go back to the contract, because the contract is always going to dictate, what is supposed to happen. And again, if we said to our buyers, hey, you get to keep the washer and dryer, but we never put it in the contract, well, then we're going to have to figure out a way to make that right for our buyer. And whether that's us buying them a washer and dryer or renegotiating the price, we're going to have to figure out what to do in that particular instance. What's also not included are pool pumps and any related equipment to pools. So if your home does have a pool, make sure you write in this line pool pump and related equipment, because otherwise it can be assumed that the seller may take the pool pump with them when they leave. Now, the likelihood of that happening is low, but again, just to make that extra protection for us, we want to include pool pump and related equipment in this line whenever there's a home that has a pool. The same thing too, things that we want to include with the home, we can specifically exclude things with the home. So let's say that the seller is going to take the refrigerator with them, we would write here on line E, refrigerator. Even though it's assumed that the refrigerator is going to stay, the seller can make an exception to any particular item. But again, we want to make sure that that is in writing. So as you're walking through the property, as you're looking to move forward, making an offer on a home, we also want to say, hey, what are some things that you want to keep in this home, besides the usual items? So washer and dryer, appliances, anything that's a little bit different and that's not specifically listed here in paragraph 1D, we want to make a specific note of that. Any questions on that? Cool. Okay, paragraph number 2. So paragraph number 2 is the big one. That has to do specifically with the pricing and the financing of the home. So one of the reasons that we always have our buyers get pre-approved or pre-qualified before we show them property is, one, the seller is going to want to see an offer, a pre-approval letter with an offer. But 2, we need to know that information when we're submitting the offer itself. We need to know, are they going to pay cash? Are they going to use FHA financing? Are they going to have a 5% down payment or a 20% down payment? We need to know that information because it's specifically going to ask us to fill that information out in the contract. So with that, there's a couple numbers that we need to know. And again, what's nice when you're using Transaction Desk, it automatically adds up all the numbers for you. So if you purchased a home for $100,000 and you say you're going to put a 20% down payment, it knows exactly what the remaining balance to close is. So again, you don't have to worry about adding it yourself. The software will do that for you. But again, we want to know the purchase price. So that's obviously the biggest thing. And then we'll want to know the escrow amount. So the escrow amount is the money that the buyer puts in escrow, holds as a deposit while they're under contract. Typically speaking, for most properties under $300,000, $400,000, we'll see about $1,000 in escrow. Usually properties over $300,000, $400,000, I've seen anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000 in escrow. And then obviously the higher price you go, typically the seller wants to see more in escrow. There's no legal requirement, there's no standard practice on what is to be put in escrow. It's all a negotiated amount between the buyers and sellers, what is to be put in escrow. You don't have to put all the money down in escrow at once. So let's say the seller wants the buyer to put $10,000 in escrow. The buyer might say, okay, I'll put $2,000 down today when we sign the contract. I'll put another $2,000 down when it passes inspection, and then I'll put the remaining $6,000 down when it passes appraisals. It gives us the option here where we talk about additional deposits to say, okay, we'll put this money down throughout the term of the contract. We don't have to come up with all escrow deposit immediately. But if we do, it asks us, typically we want to check this box is to be made within 3 days, and then we'll put the information of the title company here. Usually the listing agent provides the title company, but we as a buyer's agent can always pick a title as well. But usually whoever picks it is also the person that pays for it. So just make your buyers aware that if they're comfortable picking a title company, they usually also have to pay for those title services as well. This big one here, so line 2C or paragraph 2C, line 38, financing. So again, that's specifically asking how much of the property is going to be financed. So if this person's getting an FHA loan, and there's a 3.5% down payment, that means their financing amount is going to be 96.5%. So we can do two things. We can put in this line 96.5%, or we can calculate, based on the purchase price, what is 96.5% of the actual purchase price of the home, and then enter that line here. So again, this line is the financed amount. It's not the down payment amount, it's the financed amount. Because again, if you switch, put the down payment amount here and then the finance amount here, it's going to assume that your buyer has a lot more cash than they actually do. So we want to make sure that this is the appropriate amount, that the amount that they're financing is the amount that you're going to put on the financing line. And again, it's much easier just to put the percentage there because the software is going to add it up automatically for you. And then at the end, so we take our purchase price, subtract our escrow, subtract our financing amount, and then line 2E, this balance to close. So that's essentially what our down payment is going to be. This particular line does not include closing costs or any prepaids or prorations. That's going to be additional on top of this. So again, if the home is $100,000, we're using FHA financing. We know that our down payment amount, let's say we put $1,000 in escrow. So that means our total that we're going to have to bring to the closing table is $2,500. Because if our total down payment is $3,500, well, 1,000 of that we had to put in initial escrow, and the remaining 2,500 we're going to have to bring at the closing table. So our initial escrow amount will be put towards our down payment if we actually close. If we decide to cancel the contract, we could potentially get this escrow money back, and we'll talk about some of the scenarios in which that you got to be aware of when that will and won't happen. But that money, assuming the property is going to close, is going to go towards the down payment on that. So any specific questions on that as far as purchase price, escrow, financing, things like that? Okay, sounds good. Paragraph number 3 has to do with when the seller has to accept our offer. So usually speaking, today is July 18th. So if I'm writing a contract today, submitting it to the seller today, usually you want to put about 48 hours for the seller to review and respond to your offer. You don't have to do 48 hours. I mean, you do as little as 3 hours and as long as a week if you wanted to. And again, that's all negotiable. But typically we see about 2 days turnaround time from the time you submit an offer to a seller to the time that they should respond to you with a counteroffer. The 3 ways that a seller can respond. So let's say we submit an offer, the seller can do one of 3 things. They can accept the contract completely as presented. So they like everything that we have to say. They're not going to make any counteroffers whatsoever, and they just outright accept it. They can outright reject it too. They don't even have to provide a counteroffer. We just say, no, we don't accept your contract. So that's second option. The third option is that they can provide a counteroffer to us. And usually that's what happens most often. Most sellers out of the gate won't just accept our offer, and most sellers out of the gate usually won't reject our offer unless we're submitting, a very, very lowball offer with, terrible terms for the seller. More often than not, they'll counteroffer. And so usually we give them 2 days for them to be able to formulate what their counteroffer should be. And then once they submit a counteroffer to us, usually we then again have 48 hours to submit a counteroffer back. Or if we decide to accept it or decide to reject it, we can do that as well. Closing date. So closing date, again, everything is negotiable in this contract, but typically speaking, closing date, a lot of that has to do with the type of financing that the client is going to get, as well as the specific needs of the buyer and seller. So usually speaking, if it's a conventionally financed loan, we're looking at about a 30-day closing period, and maybe a week or two, or a week, longer, or a week shorter, but usually 30 days with conventional financing. With FHA and VA financing, we've seen anywhere from about 30 to 45 days. And then any other special type of financing, USDA, some sort of construction renovation loan, it could be anywhere from 45, 60, 90 days plus, depending on the particular special circumstances of that loan. With cash, it can be as little as 2 weeks that the property is going to close too. So again, the type of financing that the buyer is going to use is going to determine when we put the closing date. But again, it could also be that, even though the buyer is using cash to close, maybe the seller is not going to move out until the end of next month. And so again, closing dates, we can always use as a negotiation point to say, maybe our buyer is able to close sooner, maybe the seller has to close later. We'll use that as a negotiation point. But typically those dates, conventional 30 days, FHA, VA 45 days, specialty loans 45, 60 days plus, and then cash closing about 2 weeks from the time that we have an executed contract. Questions on that? So I mentioned the term executed contract. So an executed contract is very important. It's a specific legal description, and that will dictate the rest of the contract. So let's say today is July 18th, and we go back and forth and we negotiate and we agree on all the terms. We, the buyers, and then the sellers. So my buyers today sign all the contract documents on July 18th. We submit all of the documents to the seller on July 18th, but the seller takes a day for them to review, sign, and return it to us. So we don't receive the copy back until July 19th. So the effective executed date of the contract, the effective date, is then going to become July 19th. Because that's the day everybody received fully signed copies of all contract documents. And the reason that's important is because when we talk about how many days in your financing period, how many days in your inspection period, it's going to specifically go off what the effective date is. And so that's something that we want to make sure that we understand. This is the date when everybody received all the signed copies of the contract. That is the date in which we start counting all of our specific deadlines and specific requirements too. Hohman Homes internally, we use a software called Folio. It ties together with your Google account. It ties with your Google Calendars, Google Contacts. And so what we can do is we can specifically say, okay, today's the effective date. We know our inspection period's 10 days from now, so it knows, okay, this is going to be the end of your inspection period. This is the end of your financing period. And then it'll set alerts on your Google Calendar to you and whoever else you set it up for to say, this is the end of the inspection period, or your financing period is ending in 2 days. You'll make sure you have all these documents ready to go. But because there are a lot of dates, and because a lot of them have to do with specific timelines and when and if we get our escrow back, it's very important as we as real estate agents understand the specifics of the dates. When do things start? When do things end? Because again, there could be thousands of dollars in play on who gets those items. Paragraph 5 just has to do with the new CFPB requirements, that if for whatever reason the lender cannot satisfy all of the new requirements per the new regulation, we're allowed to extend the contract 10 days without any penalty for either side. Paragraph 6, occupancy and possession. It's essentially asking whether or not there's going to be a tenant in the property. Is this property currently being leased? And if so, that's something that we want to know. So let's say we're a buyer of a property and we're going to buy it as an investment. Typically we want a renter in there because that's how we're going to make money on it. So that's something that, yes, we probably want the lease to continue. We want the tenant to stay in there. If we're a buyer buying our primary residence and there's still a tenant in there and their lease doesn't expire for another 3 months, that's something that we need to know before buying this property. We might extend the closing period, or we might even have to, kick out the tenant depending on when we close on the property. But again, paragraph 6B just alerts the buyer and the seller that yes, there is a tenant in here, and yes, there's an active lease that's going on with this. Paragraph 7, assignability. Again, this has a lot to do with when we're working with investors, or sometimes we see this with wholesalers as well. If you're using this contract and working with your primary buyer, you're going to check the may not assign his contract. What assignability means is essentially is that while this contract, the terms of the contract stay the same, the people that are held to those terms of the contract, those can change. So let's say I have a buyer, let's say Nico Hohman is buying this property, and per the contract, Nico Hohman is going to close on August 30th. Well, sometime between today and August 30th, I'm going to create an LLC. Let's say Nico Hohman Buys Homes LLC. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign this contract from Nico Hohman to Nico Hohman Buys Homes LLC. So if I said may assign and release, or even may assign and not release under liability, I'm allowed to do that. I'm allowed to change it to my LLC. But if I don't click this assignability, then I am responsible, Nico Hohman is responsible for buying this property, and I won't be able to assign it to anybody else. So again, if we're working with a primary buyer that's using this home as their primary investment, primary purchase, you always click may not assign. If you're working with an investor, we want to find out, how do they plan on taking ownership? Is it individuals, the LLC, different group? That might make a difference in how we assign this particular property, or assign the terms of the contract with this property. Any questions on that? Cool. Okay, paragraph 8 has to do with financing. If they're buying cash, pretty simple. We click box 8A and then move on to the next paragraph. Cash is pretty simple. Financing, though, takes a little bit longer. So that's, again, something we need to know beforehand, how the buyer is going to purchase the property. And if they are going to use financing, we need to know what type of financing that particular buyer is going to use. So again, if they're going to use financing, we click on 8B, and then it says, again, what type of financing is the buyer going to get? Are they going to get a conventional loan, FHA, VA, or other type of loan? We need to specifically include that in the contract. Again, let's say your buyer is approved for a FHA loan, but then decide to switch to a conventional loan. They can do that during the terms of the financing period, but we just need to make everybody aware of that's what's going on. The seller has the opportunity to reject it if they don't want to, but at least, for now, we need to say, okay, we're approved for FHA. We're going to move forward with this contract as if it's FHA. So we check the FHA box. And we want to usually, again, this 30 days to get to loan approval is usually a pretty standard amount. General note, when you see specific terms in the contract, you'll see a lot of times it says, if left blank, then X. So a lot of times it's just assuming that if you leave this line blank and it gives you a recommendation as if you were to leave it blank, that's what we're going to assume. My philosophy is that even if you are going to do 30 days, don't leave it blank, fill it in. It's always better that if we have something in writing, that way everybody sees it, everybody knows there's absolutely no doubt that we're going to be doing 30 days here. So anytime you see, if left blank, then X, always fill it in just in case. Especially if we're going to do something longer or shorter than what's recommended, we always want to make sure that's specifically included. But again, we need to figure out what type of financing they're going to use, how long it's going to take for them to get approved for that financing, what type of interest rate are they going to get? Is it fixed, adjustable, or both? What is their interest rate? And then how long is the term of the mortgage? So understanding kind of what mortgage rates are doing right now. So they're right around 3.5%, 4%. So if we were to put, 2.75% here, buyer's probably not going to get finance approval at 2.75% because that's not where interest rates are. If we put not to exceed 8%, then we're pretty safe that the buyer is going to get, their approval for something under 8%. So this is something too that you might want to talk with the mortgage representative for the particular buyer and say, hey, what do you expect their interest rate to be? And then maybe bump it up by half a percent or even a whole percent, just in case we need to change it later on.
And that's where we'll find out the time frame too.
Correct. Yep. So in your in the pre-approval letter or pre-qualification letter with the buyer, the mortgage rep will say, this is the maximum amount that the buyer can purchase. This is what they recommend the maximum amount for a down payment is. they recommend that they can get financing at a conventional loan, 30-year fixed rate at X%. So in the pre-qualification letter, it's going to tell us those exact terms. So then we can fill it out here on the contract. Paragraph or line 91 here. We need to say, from the time that we have a ratified contract, how quickly is that buyer going to start making their loan application? Again, 5 days is pretty good. Things you might be aware of, maybe it's around holidays, we might say 7-8 days. Banks are closed and things like that. So again, you might want to be aware of what's coming up in the future, so that way we know when the buyer is going to start. Typically speaking though, if you have a pre-approval letter, the buyer's already at least started that process. And so it's pretty easy for them to, from the time they sign the contract to the time they start going into underwriting, that process has already been pretty well taken care of. Generally speaking, on the contract and all the contract documents, each line is numbered. And each line that has a star, that's something that we have the opportunity to fill in too. So after you're done reviewing the contract, I would just go up and down the entire contract, find out where all the stars are and say, okay, did I have to check something here? Was there a requirement for me based on my buyer's conditions, based on the property's conditions? Did I have to fill something out here? Again, it's just a good check for you to always go back and take a look at that. The rest of the financing paragraph here, it specifically says what happens if it fails. And then what are the buyer's responsibilities if they are unable to get financing, and what are the seller's requirements if they're unable to get financing. Typically speaking, if a buyer has done everything that the bank has asked of them, they've submitted all their documents, they've done everything on time, and they have written record to prove this, but they still just can't get financing for the property, the buyer is allowed to get their escrow deposit back. A lot of times what we see though is that buyers aren't so good at submitting all their documents, or maybe they're late, or maybe they're just not going to respond to their mortgage rep. Well, per this contract here, per this paragraph, the listing agent is legally allowed to contact the mortgage rep and say, hey, what's going on with this buyer? Are they submitting all their documentation? Is this going to move forward? And it also, as a buyer's agent, also allows us to continue to follow up with the mortgage rep too. So both buyer's agent and seller's agent are allowed to contact the mortgage rep and say, hey, what's going on with this particular property? What's going on with the status of the buyer? Because again, part of the contract period is the financing period. And if they're not going to be able to get financing, that's something that we need to know ahead of time in order to say this contract's going to close, it's not going to close, and if it doesn't close, who gets that escrow deposit? Questions on that? Okay. The other two options for financing, they could be an assumption of an existing mortgage or a purchase money note. A lot of times you're not going to see a purchase money note. The assumption of the existing mortgage is saying that when you sell a home, not only are you selling the property, but you're selling the mortgage too. Yeah, you just need to put on the contract. Hohman, HOH. All right, any questions on the financing clause, financing paragraphs? Sounds good. Okay, next up is closing costs. So typically during a contract, again, you have the buyer that's responsible for their financing and their down payment, but then there are also costs associated with closing a particular property. And those costs are everything from inspections, appraisals, taxes, closing fees, HOA fees, things like that. And here in paragraph 9A and 9B, it specifically breaks down what is the responsibility of the seller and what is the responsibility of the buyer. This is also where we would ask, if we're representing the buyer and we want the seller to pay closing costs, this is where we would put that information. So we would say, X% of the X% of the contract price to be paid in buyer's closing costs, or up to a certain dollar amount to be paid in the buyer's closing costs. If we wanted the seller to pay $5,000, if we wanted the seller to pay 1% of the purchase price in our closing costs, this is the line where we would want to add that information in there. So that way the buyers know, the sellers know that yes, the seller is going to cover this particular amount in closing costs for our client. Questions so far? Okay. I will say in general, so both the as-is and the CRSP contract, they're 11, 12 pages long. The vast majority of the information that we need to fill out are in the first 5 pages. Pages 6 through 11 are pretty much, it gives us definition. So if we're unsure specifically what something means, the contract specifically has it. And it also gives us remedies. So if the buyer or seller fail to do something that's specifically in the contract, that's where we're really going to break down and find out, okay, they didn't do this, therefore this happens. We don't have to fill out information there, but it's also good for us to review that information too. But again, when we're filling out a contract, a lot of the information that we're filling out is in the first couple of pages too. Part of the closing costs, it has to do with title evidence and title insurance. So typically we want to say at least 15 days, at least 15 days prior to closing date, a title commitment will be issued. So again, that's pretty standard, we're good there. Lines 158 and 162 have to do regarding who picked the title company. So if the seller picked the title company and the seller is going to pay for those closing services, we want them to check this box. If the buyer is going to pick the title company and pay for the closing services, we want to pick box 162. More often than not, we're going to see that the seller is going to select the title company and pay for the company. So it's usually we see line 158 selected here. We're not in the Miami-Dade area, so I don't have to worry about that. A home warranty. So if our buyers wanted to have a home warranty when they purchase the property, we have the capability to add that into contract to say whether or not the buyer is the one paying for that directly, the seller is the one paying for that directly, or we as agents are paying for that for the client. Typically speaking, your standard 1-year home warranty is going to be about $500 or so. And so anything above and beyond that, we would have to put there. But usually if you want to just give a basic 1-year home warranty to a buyer, it's about $500 here. So we have a couple recommendations who you could use for a home warranty. But again, if you want to put one in there, have it in there at about $500. Special assessments. So special assessments are very important in that if there is a special assessment associated with that property, we want to know what's going to happen to that special assessment. More often than not, a property is not going to have a special assessment, so that's not something that you need to worry about. But if there is a special assessment, that is a very big concern that we need to figure out what to do with it. And there are essentially 2 ways to deal with a special assessment. Number 1 is that let's say the closing date is August 31st. From the time today that you go under the contract to the time of closing, it is the seller's responsibility to pay their prorated share of the special assessments. After closing, once the buyer takes ownership of the property, then the buyer is going to pay for their prorated share of the special assessment. So option A is seller pays for it while the seller owns it, and then once the buyer owns the property, they pay for the special assessment. Box B says that the seller has to pay for the entirety of the special assessment prior to closing. And so that means essentially that once the buyer owns the property, they have no special assessments outstanding on their particular property. I would say special assessments are different in regards to CDD fees and condos. The CDDs and condo associations can charge a special assessment. They're not, this paragraph does not include condo associations, HOAs, and CDDs. That is a specific addendum that we'll cover later. This has to do with a public entity. So if the government or the county or the city is charging a special assessment, that's specifically what we're referring to in this instance. Again, it's something that we want to make note. So special assessments can be anywhere from $1,000 to anywhere between $10,000 over the course of a couple of years. And so they can start to get pretty expensive. And if there is one, that's something we'll want to know. It's something that's going to come up in the title search. So if you're unsure whether or not a property has a special assessment, ask the listing agent to see if they know of any. And if not, ask the title company once they do their title search to see if the special assessment comes up. Questions so far? Okay, so there's a couple of disclosures and then specifically the inspections, and then that pretty much covers the as-is. So here in this contract, the as-is contract, and the same thing in CRSP, we're going to find a couple disclosures about rate on gas. That rate on gas is a naturally occurring gas. It may come up in your home. You're allowed to do a rate on gas inspection if you want to. Permitting. So per the contract, if the seller knows of an open permit on the particular property, the seller is required to give that information to the buyer. And that's everything from the contact information to the contractor, the inspector, the plans, but they are not required to close that permit. So that's a big thing here, is that while they may sell a home with an open permit, the seller isn't required to close that open permit. But they are required to give the buyer all the information necessary to close that permit. Now we can negotiate that. We can add a special provision into the contract that says, no, we are closing this property contingent upon the seller finishing and completing that permit. Just this year, actually July 1st, there's a new law in the state of Florida that says after 6 years, if a permit is still open, it automatically closes. And so, a lot of times we see homes that, maybe a long time ago that they, added a new AC, but they didn't get a permit on that. Or they got a permit, but they never closed it by inspecting it. If it happened more than 6 years ago, it's no longer going to affect your closing. It's only permits that have been opened within the last 6 years. Is that going to make a difference for us? Flood zone and elevation certificate. So this is something that's pretty important here in the state of Florida and Tampa Bay, because most of the area that you'll find is going to be in a flood zone. I should take that back. Technically speaking, every zone in the state of Florida, every home in the state of Florida is in a flood zone. It's just a matter of whether or not that flood zone is required to have flood insurance. And so that's specifically what this is telling us here, is that we have the time as the buyers to be able to determine the flood zone of this particular property. We have the availability to get an elevation certificate, and with that information, knowing which flood zone that we're in and what the elevation of our home is, we know what our flood insurance rate is going to be. There is a special addendum to the property that if your home is in a flood zone, you may add the addendum, the flood zone addendum, to your property that says, the buyer has an opportunity to get flood insurance. If the flood insurance is not below X dollars in annual premium, the buyer may cancel the property. So if you know that your home is on a river, on the Gulf, on the bay, and it's likely to have flood insurance, that's something that we want to consider, is adding the flood insurance addendum, just as a way to protect your buyer, just as a way to say, look, we know this property has flood insurance. Worst comes to worst, we can't find something that's inexpensive, it's going to fit our budget. We can always back out of the contract and get our escrow deposit back.
Does it depend on which flood zone, because it's like some AV?
Correct. Yep. So there are, like you said, there's the flood zone. If your home is not, or if your home is in a zone that's not required to have flood insurance, that's flood zone X. All other zones will have flood insurance requirements. So it depends. So a home that is directly on the Gulf of Mexico is going to be a little bit different. That's a home, inside Hillsborough County that's on a small river. Those, while they're still in a flood zone, the requirements for flood insurance are going to be a little bit different on that particular property. So one might have, $5,000 in annual flood insurance premium, whereas another one might only have $500 in annual flood insurance premium. Yep. So absolutely. And a lot of homes in South Tampa, Davis Island, Harbor Island, even some homes in Seminole Heights and West Tampa along the Hillsborough River are required to have flood insurance too. So that's something, it's nice. Every MLS listing specifically has the flood zone. And so we can look to see when we're purchasing the property what the zone is. And we can always give that buyer the heads up and say, hey, I know you really like this home, but just be aware it's in a flood zone that requires flood insurance. Couple other disclosures here. So lead-based and homeowners association with specific addendums, we'll talk about that. Property tax disclosure statement. So generally speaking, every year a property will have property taxes assessed on them. And usually those property taxes are assessed based on the value of that home, the taxable value of that home. When you're purchasing a property, the property tax appraiser is going to assume, okay, the value of that property went up. And so just because your taxes were $2,000 this year, don't assume that they're going to be $2,000 next year, because you bought your property at a higher price than originally it was sold at, the property taxes are going to go up as well. And so that's specifically, telling and alerting the home buyer to be aware your property taxes will go up. And that's something too, if the owner says, hey, the property taxes are low on this property. Well, they might have had it for 30 years, and so their property taxes went up very, very slowly over that period of time. Or they had that property homesteaded, and if your buyer is going to buy it as an investment property, well, their property taxes are going to go especially higher, because they're not going to be able to homestead the property too. So that's something to be aware of when you're a buyer, is that your property taxes are always going to go up. This paragraph here, in line 230, FIRPTA, the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, that specifically has to do is if your seller is a foreign national. So if your seller's from a different country and they're selling property here in the United States, up to, I believe it's 15%, it might be higher, of the proceeds of that property will be held and reviewed by the IRS before release. And so that's essentially making sure that you're not laundering money through real estate. And that's essentially what that act was there to do. Okay, now moving on to the big part here, so the inspection. So again, this is the biggest difference between the as-is contract and the CRSP contract, is the inspection and maintenance period. And specifically in as-is, we have the property inspection with the right to cancel. So there's a lot of bold print here in this particular paragraph 12A, but a lot of it is important. And it essentially says that the buyer shall have 10 days after the effective date, called the inspection period, within to perform any and all desired inspections on the property. So that, let's say, tomorrow, July 19th becomes our effective date. So we have 10 days. So till July 29th, we have 10 days to do any and all inspections that we want to on that home. So inspections include a general home inspection, a wind mitigation inspection, a 4-point inspection. We can do a structural inspection, a pool inspection, a pest and termite inspection, a roofing inspection. Any particular inspection that we want to do on the property, we as the buyers have the right to do it. We have to pay for it, but we have the right to do all those inspections. Within that 10 days, we do the inspections, we get the inspection reports back. We now as buyers can determine what we want to do. We can either go to the sellers and say, sellers, the home looks good, we're going to move forward with this particular home. Or we could say, you know what, sellers, there's something wrong with the inspection report, we're going to cancel the contract and back out. Per this paragraph here, we as the buyers can back out of the contract for any reason that we want to. It could be there's a little scratch on the wall and we don't like it, and we're going to back out of this contract. This contract, the as-is contract, does not exclude any reason whatsoever. All it says that the buyer has to do is notify the seller in writing that they're going to cancel the contract. That's it. You don't have to give a reason. You don't have to say why. You don't have to say what you're going to do. You just have to submit in writing to the sellers before your inspection period is up, so before 10 days, that you're canceling the contract. And if you do that, you'll get your escrow deposit back. Now that's per the letter of the law. That's what's going to happen with the as-is. In the CRSP contract, what you're going to find in the inspection period, so it specifically gives you the opportunity to have a dollar amount set for the difference in the inspection. So again, let's say that with the as-is, we do all the inspections and something was wrong with it. Again, we can back out the contract. With the CRSP contract, let's say that there is something wrong with the contract, but we agree, the buyer and seller agree to have $2,000 as their max repair limit. So now I, as a buyer, I'm stuck in the contract. If with the as-is contract gives me real easy, lets me to exit the contract real easy. The CRSP does not, because the seller legally is allowed to fix those $2,000 worth of repair, and now I, as the buyer, have to stay in that contract. If repairs are above $2,000, then I have the capability to back out. But if the repairs are below the agreed amount, the seller legally has the right to fix them first, and then the buyer has to stay in that contract. So any questions on inspections? Yep. So I would say the biggest things to be aware of is, one, how long those inspection periods are. what inspections your buyer is going to do, and then make sure you know after you get those inspection results what the buyer would like to do next. Do they want to cancel the contract? Do they want to move forward as it is? Or do they even want to renegotiate either the price of the home or some of the terms within the contract based on the results of the inspection reports? All right. Now again, so that's the last item that we would need to fill out. The rest of the contract here has specifically to do with definitions and, again, procedures should something go wrong with the contract. Where we come back in is paragraph 19 and 20. So paragraph 19 lists all the different addendums that go into a particular property. It is possible that you could write a contract and have no addendums required. It's possible that you could write a contract and 7 addendums are required. It's got nothing to do with price, it's got to do with the property itself. And so as you're looking to submit an offer on a property, one of the first things that I do is look to see, okay, do they want the as-is, or do they want the CRSP contract? And then I jump down to the addendums. Is that way I know, okay, based on this particular property, it's in a condo association. So I know, okay, I'm going to need the condo rider. I know that my buyer is going to be using FHA financing, so I'm going to have to include that one. I know that it was built prior to 1978, so I'm going to have to include the lead-based paint addendum. And let's say that I happen to know, or the person buying it, my buyer is my brother. So for that particular instance, I need the as-is contract. I'm going to need the condo rider, the FHA rider, the lead-based paint rider, and the licensee property interest rider. So one property, right there is going to have 4 different riders. If I'm buying a single-family home that's not in an HOA that was built 4 years ago, and I'm using cash, I'm going to have no addendums required. So again, one of the first things that I do is scroll down to the addendum and say, okay, what are the addendums that are needed for this particular contract? And then based on that information, I'll click on these and then I'll open up and say, okay, let's say I need a lead-based paint addendum. Great, I'm going to fill out this lead-based paint addendum added to the contract. Do we need a condo rider? Do we need an HOA rider? I'm going to fill that information out and put that in the contract. There's one addendum that I always recommend if you're representing the buyer and the buyer is going to be using conventional financing, and that's the appraisal contingency. If your buyer is using if your buyer is using FHA and VA financing, there's an appraisal contingency paragraph built into that addendum. But if they're using conventional financing or USDA financing or any type of financing that's not FHA or VA, we always want to add the appraisal contingency to the contract. So how the closing process works is that, let's say we're using conventional financing, and let's say it's going to take about 30 days to close. Typically speaking, your first 10 days are all about inspections. So all the inspections are usually done the first 10 days. Day 11 through 20 is usually all about appraisals. And then day 21 to 30 is all about underwriting and title work and closing the property. So your 2 biggest hurdles that you have to overcome are at approximately day 10 and approximately day 20. So did the home pass inspections and did the home pass appraisals? We have, with the CRSP and the as-is contract, the paragraphs about the inspections built in. So that's already built into the contract. We know that if the inspections are bad, we have some built-in protections there. It's not always built in with the appraisal. So let's say the appraisal comes in low. What do we do in that scenario? Well, if we didn't have the appraisal contingency, the buyer would then be required to pay up some additional cash because the bank is only going to provide financing on the appraisal price, not the contract price. Whereas the appraisal contingency is going to give that, it's going to give your buyers a little bit of ease saying, okay, if the home doesn't appraise for our contract price, we have some options here. We can either choose to move forward exactly how it is and okay, we'll come up with additional cash. We can either walk away from the contract completely now and get our escrow deposit back, or we can negotiate with the seller to get some mutual amounts, whether the seller comes all the way down to the appraised price or we meet somewhere in the middle. The appraisal contingency allows us to do that. If we didn't have the appraisal contingency in there, our buyers might be stuck having to come up with additional cash to be able to purchase this particular property. So again, even if you don't have to have any addendums to your contract, I'd always recommend adding the appraisal contingency. It's, again, especially when you're representing a buyer, it just gives you that extra layer of protection. And especially if you think that the price of the home is too high, I'd especially add the appraisal contingency. That is definitely going to help you with negotiations. And then again from there, if we had any additional terms that we wanted to add that aren't specifically included, we can write those in here. We need to get our buyers and sellers to sign it, and then we're good to go. And that pretty much is the as-is and the CRSP contract. So with that, in general, any questions about that? I know that was a lot to go over. Good news is with the transaction desk is that when you're in your transaction desk typing up a contract, I can also be in transaction desk and we can both be looking at the exact same contract. So you could be at your house on your laptop, I could be here at the office on the laptop, and we can both be reviewing and editing the exact same file. So I might go down and say, hey, go to line 183. I saw you check to line 185. We should check line 183. And I can do that right there, or you can do that right there, and we're both looking at the exact same contract. So that's something that I always recommend. Anytime you're submitting a contract, please send it to me for my review. Even if you think it's good to go, I'm happy to review it. Make sure all your terms and documents are all in a line, ready to go. And obviously, your first couple, I'm certainly going to be helping you, with that process too. But once you fill it out, you'll find that you're going to fill out a lot of the same things. So we even have some templated documents. So let's say you're going to buy a property with cash. We have a lot of the documents that are templated that are check. So all you got to do is fill out a price and a buyer, and you're good to go. So you'll start to see as you do more and more of these, a lot of the terms are going to be, exactly where to go to update the contract. Exactly which lines to go to fill them out. But one of the things that's part of our mentorship program is we're going to specifically handle a contract. We're going to go over a specific sample property, and we're even going to have you guys fill out contracts yourself too, for us to be able to review and make sure that they're good to go. All right. So any questions on that? Sounds good. Cool. Well, everybody online, thanks for watching. Everybody here in person, thanks for coming. This video and the audio is recorded, so we'll have this until if you have any questions about this, if you're on that contract, you always come back and watch this video, listen to the audio, and help you fill out from there. All right.